Now, a new generation of South African documentary photographers was produced after the first democratic elections in this country back in 1994. Lindokuhle Sobekwa is one of them. After taking part in the Of Soul and Joy photography education program in Thokoza back in 2012, Sobekwa came to the realization that photography is a vital tool for him, at least, to convey the stories he wants to communicate. This week, he was awarded this year's FNB Art Prize and joins us now live via our video link for more on his work and possibly the way ahead. Lindo, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. Congratulations are in order, I think is a first necessary thing to say. Tell us a bit more about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I mean, I am a documentary photographer, so my work basically sort of looks at social issues, but of course also looks at history, looks at the present, like now. You know, I would say my work sort of reflect like this time, you know, yeah.
Documentaries for many people actually speak to motion pictures, but you are a documentary photographer. Let's unpack that a bit more. How do you go about telling your story as a documentary in stills?
Yeah, I mean, like with me, basically I work with, you know, like with projects that sort of concern me. You know, like my early body of work was about like Nyaope. You know, from that I did projects such as, you know, Place of Peace, Delside, and now I'm currently working on Ezilalini. So my work basically, you know, it's like a long-term, you know, project. You know, I dedicate time to work on these, you know, projects, develop trust with the people that I'm photographing. So, yeah, I mean, I would look at my work basically as that, like as, you know, that engagement that I have, you know, with the people. So, I mean, the whole purpose of doing the work that I do, you know, like I've said, is to reflect the times, but of course also is to start conversation with you know, with my photography, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's always a story behind some of the artistic decisions made by artists, including yourselves. Tell us your story. Why decide, for instance, as a start to hone in on Nyaope and its effects?
Can you please repeat your question?
Essentially, I'm trying to understand what underpinned the decision for you to go and study certain aspects of life. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, that part of your work speaks to Nyaope and its effects. What drove you to that?
Of course, I mean, my work, for example, Nyaope, it was basically looking at the, you know, the effect that the drug had to Amachita, which I was working with, you know, at the time, of course, to the health and to the community. And of course, also like, we then continued chapter 2, where we're looking at like some of our Amachita who have came from rehabilitation centers and, you know, trying to, you know, to heal. So that was like a participatory approach where, you know, some of the stories, they read them, where, you know, they wrote them down, you know, so, yeah, so basically, you know, it was like that. I mean, the whole purpose again was to, you know, for people to be sort of aware of these, and of course, to understand where some of Amachita came from. Because, yeah, I mean, they were, you know, they came from almost similar background as, you know, I am. You know, we grew up in the same place, but also we're faced by the same challenges. So, yeah, I mean, that project was basically, you know, about that, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're hearing me.
I hear you loud and clear, Lindo. I hope you can hear me too. You know, there's been ongoing debates, for instance, about at which stage photographers just capture what they see versus intervening in whatever it is they're studying. The name escapes me, but there's that prominent picture, of course, of, you know, a vulture and a baby who looked like he was in a deserted area. And I think the guy who took that photo ended up dying by suicide because of the guilt he felt afterwards and the criticism he faced. How do you kind of negotiate those things for yourselves, especially because, as you've mentioned, in some ways you're able to resonate with the lived experience of the people that you're capturing, at least in that story, I mean, that work around Nyaope?
Yeah, I mean, the photographer you're talking about is Kevin Carter. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, of course, you know, like, you know, my approach to photography is one that is very sensitive, and it's one, of course, that, you know, as an understanding of Ubuntu, you know what I mean? So I wouldn't photograph people in certain situation, and of course, if I'm required to help at the time, you know, I mean, I'm putting the camera in the back and I'm helping. I mean, I'm not the type of photographer that is always there, with the camera in people's faces. So my approach is the one that is very respectful, and of course is the one that tries by all means to collaborate. That's why I mentioned something like long-term bodies of work. That means that of course, it's not a once-off thing. It's a long-term. It's a follow-up. I mean, many projects have taken me, to 3 to 4 years. Sometimes like working on them. So. I mean, I think, we learn so much from the stories of Kevin Carter and many photographers, of course, who've been on the similar situation. Of course, we're learning from photographers who've acted differently in similar situations. So it's always great to also reference that history and also learn from it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Are you getting a sense that we're getting better at that? I mean, this idea, for instance, of being respectful to the people you're photographing is something that I think people are still trying to negotiate.
Yes, I think we're getting better, of course. I mean, given the sort of history of photography and of course how photography was used, to more especially to black bodies, and now we're seeing young black photographers are making work. Of course that is very sensitive. And of course, that is very respectful and collaborative. I mean, I can mention, photographers who actually, have changed the lens, sort of decolonizing the lens. You can see that, it's slowly changing. I mean, photography is one medium which has always had to sort of reinvent itself. You can look at, all the histories of photography, and now you will see that, it has always sort of reinvented itself. It has always, more especially, photographers have always tried to find ways of, collaborating with the people that they're making images of.
Yeah. You speak about collaboration a lot, and I'm hoping we'll be able to dive into that with a bit more detail. But let me preface my question with this story. I've had many conversations with colleagues in the journalism space who speak about the sense of guilt they feel after going into certain communities, telling their stories, and then just pulling out thereafter. You engage with these different figures, the help they need. In some instances, these people look to you as a sign of aid, but all you can really do is just tell their story. How do you kind of work your way through those kind of sentiments and emotions?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because also I think that's one thing which I've realized over the years that, it's sort of been the responsibilities that are always placed at the photographers, or image makers, I mean, but of course, it has never been placed on artists who draw or make paintings of the similar subject matters. But, I think the importance of art is to make things visible, you know what I mean? So if it was in photography, we didn't know about what happened here in South Africa during the apartheid times. So the photographers of that time managed to capture what was happening here, and of course, and of course, people were aware of such things. So that's the importance of photography or of art itself. I mean, if you look at images of the June 16, 1976 of Sam Nzima, I mean, these photography were very important for people to be aware of. Of course. Change requires not, yes, photography will be like a starting point to that, but also requires a lot of conversations, So people, if they saw that 1976 image, they started, having conversation about it. And of course, that led into the change. So change requires a lot of steps, if you know what I mean. So, and I think also I mean, we've seen that over the years with many photographers that, came after, of course. Zanele Mholi as well, their work also, for me has impacted change. So I guess that's what we're trying to do, But of course also to express ourselves, which is most important so that people can relate with the work that we do.
Absolutely. As you're speaking, we've been playing some of your stills, and I must say there's a consciousness in some of your photography, almost a delicacy to how you've captured some of your subject matter. I don't know if that's politically correct to even say that. But I wonder if any of those images stay with you.
Sorry, I lost you a little bit.
Sure. I was asking if any of the images that you've taken over the years stay with you, any that have resonated with you for whatever reason.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, more especially like the work that I'm working on now, like photographs of my mother. I've tried to collaborate with her. We've traveled back and forth from the Eastern Cape to Johannesburg, which is part of another project called Ezilali in the Country, which looks at basically the migration, issue, when gold was discovered in the 19th century in Johannesburg. So a lot of migrant workers started relocating here, and it was sort of called home, you know what I mean? But not basically regarded as home. So a lot of people never returned back to their homelands. They stayed here and they worked. My mother was one of those people. And of course, that is sort of like a history that a lot of people can relate to it in South Africa. So I grew up in Johannesburg, so I struggle with this idea of home because people will always ask you where you're from. And, like if you say, oh, I'm from Chogoza, no, like where you really from, So I have to say, oh, I'm from the Eastern Cape in Zoma where, my mother's from. So through that project, we managed with my mother to kind of go back and forth, with her, and of course, learning some of my family history and of course a lot of oral history. So I made this beautiful photograph of my mother which stayed with me, where my mother, is visiting my sister's grave and my uncle, in this beautiful landscape. And, behind there, I think, like donkeys. So that photograph for me is one that has actually, stayed with me because, like my mother was one of the people that I first photographed, one of the people that, criticized my work or said, I don't like this. So I learned from people that I photograph in terms of having that sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that feedback was very honest, and we're all grateful because look at how far you've come because of that. Lindokuhle, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. If the current work you've got out here is anything to go by, I know there are great things that still lie ahead. Lindokuhle speaking to us there in his capacity as a documentary photographer. Lindokuhle Sobekwa, also one of the winners of the FNB Art Prize. Thanks very much indeed for your time.